Generous introduction, and thank you all, ladies and gentlemen, for your attendance here today for what I hope will not be too obscure or meandering a talk. I won't go into my associations with Wider because Finn has admirably summarized all of them, but I should say, I have to say, that one of the pleasures of my life has been coming every year to Finland for the past 8 years, I believe, to attend these wider board meetings and to once again to visit Finland and to enjoy the hospitality of this wonderful country, and also to engage with particularly the young economists and other researchers at Wider. So it has always been my pleasure to come here, and after my term on the board ended, I thought perhaps I might never see Finland again, but thanks to Finn's generous invitation, here I am once again. Finn took away my notes, so maybe he thought that I don't need notes, which I don't usually use notes when I teach in Columbia, but before this audience I have to have at least a crutch of some notes to refer to. Anyway, without further ado, let me get into the subject of the talk. I've given her with this rather peculiar title called the Trade Development Nexus in Theory and History. So what do I mean by Trade Development Nexus? Well, the idea is in economics we divide we have two separate fields. One is called international trade and one is called economic development. The traditions of these fields have been very different. International trade was established by David Ricardo, about a couple of hundred years ago. And in international trade, the tradition has been to assume that all of the factors of production, technology, all of those things are all given. In other words, they don't change over time. So what we want to study is how the factor endowments and the technologies of all the different countries at any particular point in time, how do they all balance out with each other in determining the pattern of trade, international prices, and so on. So that is what international trade has been all about. And that has been true from the time of David Ricardo, John Stuart Mill, Alfred Marshall, Bertil Ohlin, Ely Heckscher, and even down to Paul Krugman, last year's Nobel laureate in the field of international trade. They all study with given resources, given technology, how does trade affect the allocation of resources and the determination of prices and so on. In economic development or economic growth, we do a different thing. We don't look at a point in time, we look at what happens over time. And so we want to study what happens to capital accumulation, the level of technology, and what does that do to per capita incomes, to prices, to things like that. So these are two, one field is dynamic, looking at how things change over time, and the other field is sort of static, looking at things at a given point in time. My interests have always been in both of these fields, but not as separate things. My interest has always been in the interaction or the intersection of trade and development. You can draw a circle that's international trade, you can draw another circle that's economic development, but these two circles are not separate, they overlap, right? And there's a common intersection which we can call trade and development, or the trade development nexus, or the trade development connection, right? And so it is this intersection of the two fields of international trade and economic development that I have been particularly interested in since I began my career in economics now about 50 years ago. So that's where I'm coming from. That's my that's my professional métier, to look at trade and development in the process of interaction. Now, this interaction between trade and development, it can be looked at in different ways. In pure economic theory, we do it in a rather abstract way, where we make certain assumptions and then we work out logically or mathematically what the implications of these assumptions are, and then we say, well, what will happen over time if two economies are interacting with each other, and so on, right? So that's one way of proceeding, the theoretical or abstract, logically deductive process. The other way of studying the connection between international trade and economic development, as Findlay alluded to himself in connection with his experience in Vietnam, the other way to look at this relation is look at it historically. We have lots of experience with the history of international trade, with the history of economic development and economic growth as it has taken place in various countries. And we can look at the historical record and see what examples do we have. When does trade promote development and growth? When perhaps has trade hampered economic growth or development? Is it always true that the more open the economy is to outside influences, the better it performs? There are all these many kinds of questions that we would like to ask about trade and development. That on the one hand we can study abstractly through mathematical models. On the other hand, we can also study them inductively through historical experience. Now again, supposing you reach completely different conclusions by these two methods, then what would you do? Would you sacrifice your theory? Would you say that history is bunk, like Henry Ford apparently once said? Would you give up theory for history or history for theory? I don't think you need to do that. What I think is that what we need to do is look at the historical record and try to adapt our theories to the historical record. Not the other way around, not to rewrite the historical record just to make it agree with whatever model we happen to be attached to. So in the interplay between the two, in the interplay between theory and history, I think history should be in charge, right? So we have to look at the historical record to tell us, what has really happened. And then if we want to make sense out of this historical record, if we want to try to understand these processes in some sort of abstract analytical way, then we build our models, but we look at the models in the light of the historical experience. So that's what I've been doing in my career. When I started as a very young man, coming to Massachusetts Institute of Technology from the University of Rangoon, I was all analytical and very logical and so on. One of my teachers was the great economist Charles Kindleberger, and so my teacher Kindleberger said, you young fellows can do theory, but an old man like me, I rely on history. And we used to sort of maybe laugh at him, or he would think that we youngsters didn't sufficiently appreciate it. So he would say, when you become my age, I think you will agree that you have to turn to history. So it's been a long time, for many years now, I've approached the age of Professor Kindleberger when he was my teacher in 1957. So now I think I know what he said, that theory is fine, but ultimately you should judge in the light of history. So anyway, what I will be doing is looking at both history and theory in trying to make sense of the evolution of the world economy. Finn was kind enough to refer to my last book that I wrote with my young colleague Kevin O'Rourke from Trinity College in Dublin, called Power and Plenty. And so in that, let me just follow that book for a little bit, just to get ourselves started. So if you say you're going to look at the historical record for trade and development, when do you start? You start with the 20th century? Do you start with the Industrial Revolution? Do you start with the Voyages of Discovery? It's an open question as to when you start. So when O'Rourke and I wrote this book, we we became increasingly dissatisfied with the Industrial Revolution approach, with stopping at the time of the discoveries, because if you stop at the time of the discoveries, then you still have everything, it seems like, the whole world was sleeping up to 1492, then for some reason this fellow Christopher Columbus got into a ship and crossed the Atlantic, and then all sorts of wonderful things happened, right? So you have that impression if you say, let's start with the Voyages of Discovery. Then you say, well, what about India and China? What were they doing? I mean, why didn't they get into ships and sail in the ocean? So if you ask that kind of question, then you have to go back further. And so we compromised. You have to stop somewhere, so we stopped at a good round number, the year 1000. So we looked at the evolution of the world economy for the last 1,000 years. And for that purpose, we divided the world economy at that time. The interacting part of the world economy was mainly the Eurasian, what we would call Eurasia, right? And so we discussed 7 regions: Western Europe, Eastern Europe, Islamic world, Central Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and East Asia. So we have population figures that I've put down. I won't repeat them again, but you can get some sense of them. India and China still loom very, very large. India, the main region of South Asia, China, the main region of East Asia. Already there were these enormous populations in those 2 parts of the world. Western Europe was relatively lagging behind in its level of economic development and technology and urbanization and so on. And of all the 7 regions, the one that was the most central, we were somewhat surprised to discover, the one that had trade contacts with everybody else, that was best informed about all the other regions, that was the Islamic world. Right? So the Islamic world in the year 1000, it had trade connections with all of the other regions, including even East Asia. Right? And the Islamic world was very heavily urbanized, it was technologically sophisticated, and so East Asia and the Islamic world were certainly at the forefront at that time. Whereas Western Europe, by comparison, was lagging, was relatively backward, as we might say in modern parlance. All right, so that was the state of affairs roughly in the year 1000 that we discuss in the first couple of chapters of our book. Now, from the standpoint of theory, the interesting question is, if you're going to study these pre-industrial economies, economies that were operating 1,000 years ago, long before the Industrial Revolution, what sort of model are you going to apply to these countries? Could you take, say, the neoclassical growth model today that we use to analyze economic growth in the United States and Japan and China, and maybe not even China, because China is still in many ways pre-industrial, right? But should we take the model that we apply to all of the advanced industrialized regions, or should we take something else? In my view, what we should do is take the classical model, right? The classical model of Malthus and Ricardo, the model that they used for the Great Britain and Europe of their day, which was the late 18th, early 19th century. That model, I think, still fits this pre-industrial world rather well. So if we want to make sense of that period in the development of the world economy, the right model to use is this Malthus-Ricardo model. So let's try some technology. I'm going to try to draw some diagrams, and we'll see whether it works. I want to show the following thing. On the vertical axis of this diagram, we have per capita income, denoted little y, and on this axis we'll have fertility and mortality of the population. And we can draw 2 graphs, an upward sloping one for fertility and a downward sloping one for mortality. And in the Malthusian model, what we can interpret him as saying is the following thing, that as per capita income rises, fertility increases, but mortality falls. So if per capita income is above this level Y star, fertility will exceed, so if per capita income is above Y star, population will increase, and fertility will exceed mortality, population will increase. With given resources, this will tend to drive down per capita income, whereas if it is below, mortality will exceed fertility, population will fall, and with given resources, per capita income will rise. So the model says there will be some long-run, stable level of per capita income at which population will remain stationary, and that is this Y star, right? Okay, but this model tells us what the stationary state level of per capita income would be, and it says that population will be stable at this point, but it doesn't tell us what the population will be, right? So to find out what the population is, we have to look at geography. We have to look at the land, the amount of land at the disposal of this society, the technology that it has to exploit this land, and the capital stock that it is willing to accumulate and to hold at this level of development. So we do another picture. Here we can have total output, which I denote capital Y, and here we have labor, right? And labor and population are in relatively fixed proportion to each other, so if you know one, you know the other. And then we have this famous diminishing returns idea that output will increase as labor increases, but by smaller and smaller increments, all right? Because there will be diminishing returns on the given land. So given the land and given the technology, land and technology determine the level of this curve, but the demographics gives us a slope of this line which is equal to the per capita income Y star, right? Because this is total Y, this is proportionate to population, so the slope of this line, this indicates the level of income at which population will become stationary, right? So this in a very simple outline is the classical model of economic growth. So if we apply it to the year 1000, what will we notice? Well, I report from these people, McEvedy and Jones, who have done a very indispensable historical atlas of world population. If we look at their work, they tell us that there were about 80 million people in South Asia, let's say Indians, and about 70 million people in China. In East Asia, let's say most of them from China, right? So even in those days, we have the similar phenomenon that we have today, which is that 1 out of every 3 people in the world is Chinese or Indian. So why is that, right? Can the Malthus-Ricardo model give us an answer to this question? So if you think about it for a little bit, the answer is clearly, the reason has to do with these big river valleys, right? The Yangtze in China, the Yellow River and the Yangtze; in China, the Ganges and the Indus. So with these big fertile river valleys, the production level is very high, right? So if you have a very high production level, what's going to happen? If you have a small population, the per capita income will be very large. So what will happen? Then you'll have fertility more than mortality, so population will expand until diminishing returns drives you down back there, right? So this shows how population adjusts to technology and land. If you are very constrained, like the Islamic world I mentioned was very highly developed, quite technologically sophisticated, highly urbanized, but it was constrained, right? Constrained by the desert environment and so on. So it could not basically expand terribly much. Right? So although it was very extensive, it was still in this rather arid zone with deserts, circumscribed by deserts. So population was not that high. So the model can explain these relative these issues of relative size. So so we can use that model then for understanding what happens, what determines the initial starting point around about the year 1000. I mentioned that there were these 7 regions that were all interconnected across the Eurasian continent. They did have connections, they did have trade relationships. These trade relationships were restricted by very high transport costs, so the only goods that could move in long-distance trade were very valuable items. All right? You had to have a high value-to-weight ratio to be able to bear the cost of transport. So the goods that moved would be things like spices and silk and porcelain and things like that, items of great value relative to bulk. So you did have connections, but these connections were rather constrained. But the integration of these regions was prompted by one great event of the first half of the second millennium, and this was the Mongol conquest. The Mongol conquest, of course, does not have a very respectable place in history. It's been generally associated, of course, with pillage and destruction and slaughter and things like that, all of which were true, right? But at the same time, once an empire is established, what does the imperial power want to do? Well, they want goods to be produced, they want goods to be traded. Why? Out of the kindness of their hearts? No, because they want taxes, right? So what they're going to do is to promote the integration of the economic system that is under their control. And so the Pax Mongolica was a very important factor in integrating very tightly these different regions of the world economy at that time. So why were the Mongols able to do this? One of my interests is, why do empires expand? What determines the limit of the size of an empire? So if we try to look at those questions, then the reason for the Mongol success is not difficult to seek. Of course, it is that they were, because of their pastoral nomadic way of life, they were of course wonderful horsemen, and they were also very skilled archers, and they could use this composite bow, which had a very long range striking power. So with this very highly developed, very mobile military force, the range of military reach that the Mongols could have, once they became sufficiently united under Genghis Khan, was very extensive. Right? So they had this enormous empire stretching from the Pacific to the borders of Western Europe. So not surprisingly, then it was Central Asia, out of these 7 regions, that pulled many of the others together by connecting them within its imperial system. And so within their imperial system, they had, they kept the caravan routes open. They had, Marco Polo and his family could travel very safely from Venice all the way to Beijing. So it was, if you just think of it, that's a remarkable fact in itself. And it's thanks to this Pax Mongolica. So during the time from the early 13th century to the middle of the 14th century, there was a great flourishing of trade all across the Eurasian continent. Goods moved, technology moved, ideas moved, and so we have a flourishing of the world economy to a very great extent, to an extent greater than the previous times. But one of the things that we have to know is that along trade routes, you don't only move, not only do goods and ideas move very freely, but germs can also travel very, very freely along trade routes, right? And so one consequence, I mean, the major consequence at the end of the Pax Mongolica was the Black Death, right? The transference of plague germs from somewhere in Central Asia to Western Europe and the Islamic world. So the Black Death in the middle of the 14th century, around in 1346, a few years around about that time, 1/3 of the population of Western Europe and probably 1/3 of the population of the Islamic world, at least in North Africa, perished from the effects of the Black Death. Right? So that was an unmitigated catastrophe of tremendous scale. It's the greatest natural catastrophe in the history of the world, as far as I'm aware. But what was the economic consequence of this calamitous event? Well, once again, we can use the Malthus-Ricardo model, because what does the Black Death do? The Black Death, let's say, it destroys 1/3 of the population, 1/3 of the labor force, so only 2/3 is left. So what will happen? Output, of course, will fall. Right? When you had a full population, output was so much. Now with only 2/3 of the population, output has fallen. But you will notice that output, because of diminishing returns, output falls more slowly than population. So per capita income will go up. The slope of this line is per capita income after the Black Death. It's what the survivors will enjoy. Right? So after the Black Death, what happens? Per capita income goes up, wages go up. Although the total production, total volume of trade, total number of people, all of those things are down, nevertheless, everything is at a higher per capita level. The society is richer, people are richer. Right? So this is a fact that is not sufficiently appreciated, I think. But once this happens, what's going to happen? Per capita income has risen, so it will go above the previous equilibrium, right? So what will happen? Fertility will once again exceed mortality, population will increase, and slowly, as population expands, you start moving back over time to the previous stationary level, all right? So the bad news is 1/3 of the population dies. The good news is that the surviving 2/3 have a higher per capita income, so they will recover. Right? The population will recover, output will recover, production will recover, trade will recover its previous volume. But in the meantime, when the per capita income is high, everything is at a level of a higher standard of living. Right? So behavior can change, institutions can change. For example, feudal institutions in Western Europe, those could change for the better because labor is scarce. When labor is more scarce, laborers can drive a harder bargain, right? Feudal lords get weaker, workers, urban merchants get stronger, kings can get stronger because they can rely on the urban middle class against the feudal lords. So there are all these favorable power shifts in the socio-political balance coming from this event. So in Western Europe, the Black Death triggered, the recovery from the Black Death was a strongly progressive phenomenon. Right? It also had very important monetary consequences. I don't have the time to elaborate on those monetary consequences, but let it be said that when per capita income increases, demand for luxury goods increases. Where do luxury goods come from? Luxury goods at that time were the silks and satins and so on from the Eastern world. So you have an outflow of silver from Western Europe towards the East. Right? So this event is called the Great Bullion Famine of the 15th century by monetary historians. And actually, by using this classical model, this Malthus-Ricardo model, one can connect the population catastrophe of the 14th century, the demographic collapse of the 14th century, with the monetary deflation of the 15th century, which is something that economic historians don't seem to have been as well aware of as they should have been, perhaps. So these are some of the very major consequences of, I think this is the Black Death and the recovery from the Black Death is a very, very important phenomenon in the rise, what we call generally the rise in the West. But here we have one problem, right? Because as I said, not only did 1/3 of the population in Western Europe collapse or die, but 1/3 of the Islamic population, at least the Islamic population in North Africa, also was extinguished. And yet, we don't seem to have had any positive effects from that in the Islamic world. Well, one possible answer lies in the nature of the political system, right? The Western system, although it was exploitative, you had this feudal system. Nevertheless, the feudal system was somewhat decentralized. So you did not have one centralized power that was able to control everything. Whereas in the case of Egypt and Syria, they were ruled by the Mamluk sultans at that time. So you had a degree of political centralization that you did not have in Western Europe. Of course, the feudal lords, after the Black Death, what would they want to do? They would want to act collectively, right, and round up all their serfs and beat them and flog them into accepting the same unfavorable terms that they were given previously. But they couldn't get together to organize the coalition, right? There was no centralized authority. Whereas under the Mamluk sultans, these emirs or governors in the different provinces, they were all under one leader, and so they were able to act collectively in their own interest. So what did they do? They wanted to maintain the same tax revenue that they had before. Production is down, trade is down, but never mind, they increase the squeeze. So when you increase the squeeze on an economy that's already suffering a demographic collapse, then you're basically strangling the economy, right? So the Western Europe could move ahead, Islamic world to some extent move behind as a result of the Black Death. So I've mentioned, though, that the prosperity in Western Europe, this meant a boom in the luxury trades, increase of luxury imports from the East. So spices and other goods, other Eastern goods, will enter Western Europe through the Mediterranean, and to get to the Mediterranean, they would have to come to the Red Sea, so they would have to pass through the hands of the Mamluk sultans, and then they would be distributed in Europe by the Venetians. Right? The Venetians also operated as a monopoly. Right? The Venetian merchants would all act collectively under instructions from their central council. So when you have a important and prosperous trade like the spice trade of the Middle Ages, when you have it all conducted through a very narrow choke point, right, then what's going to happen? The people in charge of the middlemen, the people at the gate in between who are controlling the flow of the goods in both directions, if they act collectively, they are able to impose a monopoly, right? And so the medieval spice trade can be looked upon as a sort of a joint monopoly of the Egyptian sultans and the Venetian merchants. Right? It was kind of a double monopoly. It was a monopsony. You buy cheap, you push the purchase price down as much as possible, and you push the selling price up as much as possible. Right? I could draw another diagram, perhaps, to bear with me. So we do away with Malthus and Ricardo for the time being, and let's just say that if you have a competitive market, let's say you have the price of spices here and you have the volume of spices on the horizontal axis, and if you have a competitive market, let's say this is the supply of the spices from the Eastern world, this is the demand for the spices in the Western world, and you would have this price and this quantity demanded, right? But if you have a monopoly, you'll have what economists call the marginal revenue curve, so the monopoly will raise the price and restrict the quantity. But if you have a monopsony, you will come to this point, so you will restrict even further and the price will rise even more, right? So this is what we call in international trade a maximum revenue tariff. Imagine somebody in charge of trade that doesn't care about the welfare of the sellers of the goods, it doesn't care about the welfare of the buyers of the goods, its only interest is how much profit or revenue it can extract for itself. In that case, you would act just like this, and you would get, so the gap between the selling price in the east and the purchase price in the west would be at its maximum possible, it would be at the extent to maximize the profit of the middleman, right? So if you go to Venice, I mean, marvel at, you know, all the riches of the paintings and the, you know, the marble and all of that, the tremendous opulence of Venice. You have to realize, where does it come, you know, you naturally ask the question, where did it come from, right? So the answer is, it came from there, right? From that margin, right? And if you go to Cairo, you see what the Mamluk Sultans left, you'll also be similarly impressed. So again, for both of these things, you have to have the resources to be able to do it. So the position of middleman in this very profitable east-west trade was a very good one. To have. But as everybody who runs a monopoly, even a very successful monopoly, knows, life is not secure. Life is not stable, right? Because everybody wants to come after. You know, people are jealous of what you get, and they're going to come after you, right? To try to circumvent, to try to break your monopoly, to try to circumvent your monopoly, and somehow to cut down your profit. In the case of the Venetians, their greatest rivals were the Genoese, right? They're fellow Italians, but different city and completely different interests, mortal enemies, the Genoese and the Venetians. So the Genoese always wanted to do an end run, get around the Venetians, get around the Muslims, maybe go directly to the Far East and buy goods there. So even in 1285, there were two brothers from Genoa called the Vivaldis, not the musician's family as far as I know, but the merchant family, who tried to apparently have the idea of sailing around Africa. So they went off in some boats, but they were never seen again. But they had the idea to circumvent Africa, right? So this was a sort of a Genoese idea that by sailing west, you can, you know, either get directly to India or go around Africa. So when Columbus and Vasco da Gama, you know, did their voyages of discovery, they were both basically sort of replicating this Genoese approach, right? This Genoese idea of circumventing the Muslim and Venetian stranglehold on the trade with the East. But of course, once these voyages had been made, then the world became very different, right? The Mamluks were very quickly overthrown by the Ottoman sultans in 1516. And if you look at 1516 and compare it to 1492, there isn't very much time, not much of a time gap there. So once the Mamluks lost their monopoly of the spice trade, they became easy victims of their rival, their Sunni rivals, the Ottomans. So that's one effect. But of course, the biggest effect of all of this attempt to circumvent the Venetian monopoly by getting to the spices of the East, this was the discovery of the New World, right? So once the New World was discovered, this changed the whole balance of power in the Old World, right? Western Europe, which had always been, you know, relatively lagging as compared to East Asia. You know, East Asia at the time of the 11th century, 12th century, there was the so-called Sung economic miracle that we discussed extensively in Power and Plenty. So China was, you know, it had huge cities, it had, you know, iron and steel production of tremendous, at a tremendously high level, technology, mercantile credit, all of these things, with the use of the monetary system, all of these things were very, very advanced, right, relative to Europe. But after the discoveries, what happened? This whole new world, you know, the vast resources of the new world, they became available to the West, to the Western world. The indigenous societies, the indigenous empires, peoples, they were decimated by disease as as Jared Diamond has argued in, he was not the first one, obviously, but he pointed out, the role of, once again, the role of the germs in decimating these Native American populations and making it easy for Westerners, Europeans, to take over the New World. So once the New World was taken over, then this meant, of course, a tremendous increase in the resources at hand of the West. And the biggest resource at the beginning was silver, because the value to weight ratio was very high in the case of silver. So we get one big consequence of the discovery of the New World is the influx of silver into the whole world. The influx of silver into Europe, where we talk of the price revolution, because prices rose in Europe as a result of this silver influx. But along with these higher prices, there came prosperity, right? So, so in a sense, the inflation was accompanying revival of production and prices and so on. So the New World, the silver of the New World, stimulated economic activity in the Old World, not only in Europe, but even in the Ottoman Empire, in the Mughal Empire, and also and even as far afield as China. Right? The Chinese population went up because of New World crops. Right? It's something. So Christopher Columbus had a big impact even on China. Right? So these discoveries then really were a fundamental factor in bringing about this transition to the modern world economy. So once this New World came in, the Western world had a frontier, right? Now this term frontier we generally associate with the American West, right? This American historian Frederick Jackson Turner, he was the one who had the so-called frontier thesis that that it was the extension of the frontier in the West that that sort of had a formative impact on North American society, right? But the frontier concept can be applied to the world as a whole, right? Because in a sense, this entire New World, it meant that for Europe, this was a tremendous bonanza, right? You had all of these very rich overseas territories that could not be defended by the indigenous people. So basically they were up for grabs, right? They were up for grabs by the rising nation states of Western Europe, right? So initially, the first movers were the Iberians, the Portuguese and the Spanish, but they were soon overtaken by the Dutch and the British, and later the Dutch were too small to compete with the British and the French, and so finally the struggle for who would control the resources of the New World became one between Britain and France, right? But previously it was between Britain and the Dutch Republic. So we have this whole period that we call the Age of Mercantilism, right? Which is one in which is dominated by the competition between the rising European states for control of the resources of the New World. Of course, there were dynastic issues in Europe and local concerns and all of those things, but the broad fact underlying things like the Anglo-Dutch Wars and the 7 Years' War of 1756 to 63 between Britain and France, and even the Napoleonic Wars between Britain and France as the major rival powers. The underlying theme for all of these conflicts was basically control of the world's resources, right? Because as we know, these wars were world wars. They were not just fought in Europe. The 7 Years' War was fought in Canada, Cuba, the Philippines. So Manila was captured from the Spanish by the British as part of the 7 Years' War, right? So you see that these conflicts were global, not just parochially European conflicts. So, so the Age of Mercantilism then ended with victory for Britain, right? And so once again we have a kind of a worldwide empire, right? This time, so we have two empires that I've mentioned. The first empire was the Mongol Empire, as I said, that integrated by land these 7 regions of the Eurasian world economy, right? But the British Empire of the 18th, 19th century, this integrated the world, right? And basically by sea rather than by land. right? But once again, the explanation is not hard to see. In the case of the Mongols, it was the strength of the empire was based on their cavalry, the mobility of the cavalry, and the composite bow as the key weapon. In the case of Britain, it was the Royal Navy, right? It was the sailing ship with its artillery complement. That was the key weapon that the British were able to deploy in establishing their empire, right? So by the time we get to the victory of Britain in the Napoleonic Wars, then we are on the verge of the modern period, right? Because within this empire that the British established, what did the empire give them? Well, one thing the empire gave them was secure markets. Right? Your rivals could not supplant you by mercantilistic means in places, because you can sell to your own colonies or even to your former colonies, because they are allied to you in language and institutions and so on, like the Americans and the British. So you have secure markets for your finished goods. You have secure sources of supply for your raw materials from your extensive empire. So Britain was very successful as a commercial empire by the early 19th century. But Britain didn't end there, because as we know, the next fundamental development that took place in the evolution of the world economy was the Industrial Revolution. And where did that Industrial Revolution originate? Well, it originated in England, right? It was not due peculiarly to the English genius, although that's the traditional explanation that these inventors in Yorkshire, they got these bright ideas and applied them, which is all true, right? But to implement these ideas successfully, you needed an empire. And why was that? How was that? Well, consider the following thing. If you just have a local market and you have wonderful new machinery to produce cotton textiles and things like that, what would happen? Well, you want to sell a lot of cotton textiles, but if the market is just limited to your local demand, then what's going to happen? The price is going to fall very sharply, right? So not too many people are going to want to make this innovation, because you have to spend on these power looms and power spindles and things like that. And if prices have dropped very low, then you're not going to make a profit, all right? But if you can sell around the world, then your demand curve, as economists say, is much more elastic, right? You don't have to sell a lot and have the price drop. You can sell a lot and have the price fall just a very little bit, if at all, right? On the other hand, if you want to buy raw materials, if you want to buy things like cotton, right? If you don't have an empire, if you don't have secure access to tropical sources of cotton, the price is going to go up, right? But in the case of Britain, you had what? You had the West Indies, you had the former colonies in the United States to provide you with the cotton. Where did the labor to grow the cotton come from? That came from Africa. And the Africans, of course, didn't voluntarily migrate to undertake the backbreaking work of working in sugar plantations and cotton plantations and so on. It was a forced immigration, namely the slave trade, right? So this expansion of the world economy also brought in its train the expansion of the slave trade, which is the way in which Africa was pulled into the modern world economy. And of course, all of these developments were amplified by the Industrial Revolution. So when the Industrial Revolution takes place, you get a boost in cotton textile output and production. So what does that do? That increases the demand for raw cotton, that raises the price of raw cotton, that increases the demand for slaves, which raises the price of slaves, which raises the higher price of cotton, raises the demand for land in the western parts of the United States. So what does that do? That leads to the extension of the frontier, right? So this idea of the frontier that, as I said, Frederick Jackson Turner mentioned in connection with America in the 19th century, it really goes back further, right? We can think of the whole new world as being a frontier for Western Europe, right? And in some of my work, frontier is something that people talk about in political science and and in history, but economists haven't talked too much about the frontier. But I think that's a mistake. And one of the things I try to do is to focus on this concept of a frontier. Right? So, land, when we talk about land, Ricardo said the original and indestructible powers of the soil, right? As though land is something given, right? But land is not just given, it has to be created. I mean, there's just a wilderness out there, but if you build railway lines and canals and things like that, then land becomes accessible, it can be cleared, and so on. So, the extension of the frontier is an economic concept, all right? It's an investment, right? So we can look at the extension of the frontier as depending upon two things. What's the value of production on 1 acre of land? That depends on the price of whatever can be grown on the land. It depends on the rate of interest. Given the rate of interest, given the rent per acre of land, then the land is an investment. You can just see by how much does the land supply have to increase to drive the rate of return on land reclamation equal to the rate of interest, right? So if you have a frontier territory, I can draw another diagram where the cost of clearing land is an upward sloping function, right? Because if you go nearby, then the cost is low. If you go deeper, the deeper you go, the further west you go in America, of course, the cost of reclaiming another acre rises, right? But then as the demand for cotton rises, as the price of cotton rises, as the demand for wheat rises, as the price of wheat rises, each acre of land is worth more. So even if that acre of land is very far west, at some point it becomes worthwhile to make that investment, right? So you will make that investment, right? So you can incorporate endogenous land supply into the Heckscher-Ohlin factor proportions model of international trade, for example, right? And this was one of the factors that was happening in the 19th century. So the Industrial Revolution then, I've increasingly coming to think of the Industrial Revolution as a sort of a Faustian bargain, right? That humanity made with the devil, right? Which is, I presume, the only entity that you can make a Faustian bargain with. We think of the Industrial Revolution as a benign thing, right? It's better technology. That's undoubtedly true, right? But in order to implement this better technology, in the case of Britain, you have to have slavery in the New World to grow the cotton, to feed the machines that Cartwright and Arkwright and all of these other ingenious Yorkshire and Lancashire inventors had discovered, right? So slavery was one element in the Faustian bargain. Another element in the Faustian bargain was energy supplies, right? Fossil fuels, right? As Anthony Wrigley, a very distinguished British demographer and historian, has noted, what the Industrial Revolution did was, prior to the Industrial Revolution, all the energy supplies came from the surface of the earth, right? Either you use human power or animal power, but to use human power, animal power, you have to have crops, right? That takes up the surface of the earth, or you have to burn wood. So everything comes from the surface of the earth. So if you want food, then you have to give up fuel. And you're sort of trapped, right, by the limitation of the earth's surface. But if you can use fossil fuels like coal and later petroleum, you can go into the interior of the earth, right, for however much distance, and you can get these vast resources that are locked up, right, in these fossil fuels, right. So wonderfully, you can have the steam engine, you can have the locomotive, the steamship, all of these great things that were rightly celebrated in the 19th century. But now in the 21st century, what do we say? We say that this is, these are all the carbon emissions that are ruining the planet and threatening the future of humanity. So that is another element of the Faustian bargain. Another thing the Industrial Revolution did was the food supply, right? Britain successfully absorbed the Industrial Revolution, but then how could she feed all of these increasing number of workers? She couldn't do it with her own agricultural resources, but she could do, again, she was able to do it by the frontier, right? You could go overseas, you could get the food from Australia, Canada, United States, Argentina, and so on. So the extension of the frontier came to the rescue, right? So all of these things is what we must keep in mind in the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century. Then the trade consequence of the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century was what we call the Great Specialization, right? What Sir Dennis Robertson has called the Great Specialization. So in the 19th century, you had this very specific pattern of specialization, right? It's the European countries essentially would produce manufactured goods and export manufactured goods, and the rest of the world would produce primary products, right? Agriculture, forestry, minerals, and so on. So that was the pattern. That was the pattern of specialization. And so, how did this pattern of specialization work? Right? Well. So here we see there's trade, right? But when we talk about trade in the usual textbook model of international trade, we say country A and country B, right? Country A and country B they are sort of similar. They are on the same footing, right? Of course, each one has its own endowments and technology and so on, but they are not regarded as one being at a more advanced level than the other. They are regarded as being in a sort of level playing field, as on a horizontal, at the same level. But in the 19th century pattern of specialization, it's sort of different, right? Because modern technology, modern capital goods that you need even to produce primary products, your rice mills, your sawmills, your sugar mills, all of these things are made with machinery, right? They're made in Birmingham with iron and steel, right? Whereas in India or Burma or Ceylon or wherever, you use these things to produce these primary products. So it's an asymmetric situation, right? So to analyze this, I and some other people developed what we call North-South models, right? So the northern economy in some of my work is like a neoclassical growth model, like the type devised by Robert Solow, where you have the North produces manufactured goods using capital and labor, but then it has this exogenous rate of technological change that has come since the Industrial Revolution, right? So that sets the northern rate of growth. In the South, what sort of conditions do you have? I take the South as being represented by sort of Arthur Lewis's approach, right? Where you have a peasant hinterland, as Lewis calls it, in which people get a certain average standard of living. At this standard of living, they are ready to come and work in what he calls the modern sector, which could be plantations, right? Sugar plantations in Cuba or the Philippines, tea plantations in Assam, or jute plantations in West Bengal, and so on, right? Cocoa farming in Ghana, rubber plantations in Malaysia, things like that. So the South then specializes on these primary products, but in order to expand the production of primary products, it needs capital goods. So how does it get capital goods? By exporting primary products, right? So there's a relative price, the relative price of manufactured goods and primary products that comes into the equation, right? The higher the price of primary goods in terms of manufactures, the more capital goods the South can acquire, and the more rapidly the South can grow, right? So that is all with the goods. But if the South grows very fast in producing tea, coffee, cotton, sugar, all of these things, and if supposing it grows faster than the North, it tries to catch up, right? Then what will happen? The supply will be increasing faster than the demand of tea and coffee and sugar and all of these things. So what will happen to the price? The price will fall. As the price falls, what happens? These countries can buy less capital goods for the same amount of sugar or tea or coffee, and so their growth will slow down. So ultimately, in this North-South framework, no southern country that specializes in primary products can ever, in the end, ultimately grow faster than the North, right? Because if it grows faster, it will just simply put more of its primary product on the market, and then its prices will fall. Because all of these primary products, tea, coffee, sugar, and so on, these are non-competing goods with the goods that the West produces. The West produces manufactures, or the North, I should say. The North produces manufactures, the South produces these exotic goods that only it can produce because of its climate, right? So you cannot threaten the North with your product. The more you produce, the cheaper the price at which you have to sell it. So there's a sort of a terms of trade trap in which these individual southern nations all hot. Okay. So that was the 19th century, that was this north-south pattern that prevailed, I would say, maybe up to the 1950s, all right? But from the 1960s onwards, something very interesting happened. A new trend in the trade development nexus came about. And what was this new trend? This new trend was the South started to produce manufactured exports, right? In other words, entering the manufacturing realm, right? And how did it do this? Well, the best way to do it is not to try to jump in and produce iron and steel and so on by hothouse import substitution, but by specializing on labor-intensive manufacturers, right? So this was the pattern of Hong Kong, Taiwan, Korea, Singapore in the early stages, right? So we have the four dragons or four tigers or whatever we call it. Those were the ones who pioneered this sort of new approach of specializing in labor-intensive exports of manufactured goods. So now these things they compete with the goods produced in the Western countries, right? In Japan, for these purposes, is like a Western country. So when these new tigers start producing cotton textiles and things like that, well, what are they doing? They are threatening producers of these goods in the already advanced countries. But then they have to give up these sectors, then they can retreat, all right? You can go up the chain of value added, you can go into more sophisticated goods. Whereas on the other hand, these East Asian economies, they are climbing the ladder of comparative advantage, as we say, right? In other words, you start with labor-intensive goods, you sort of capture that market. As you succeed, your wage will rise, so you will compete yourself out of the most labor-intensive thing, but then you can go into the next, more capital-intensive thing, and so slowly you climb up, right? So Korea, if you just look at Korea, what Korea and Taiwan were exporting in the 50s and what they are exporting today, you'll see how successfully they are climbing the ladder of comparative advantage. And what inroads they have made into the manufacturing base of the already industrialized countries, right? So the good news for the South is that you can expand, you can sort of take the action into the enemy's, not the enemy, but into the rival's playing field, right? You can sort of invade their own industries, right? And you can drive them to goods that they are more competitive in, and you are less competitive in, right? But all of this is predicated on the world economy as a whole growing. If the world economy as a whole doesn't grow, then you're going to get a backlash, right? So instead of backing up your inefficient textile industry or shoe industry or whatever, you could do protection, right? So there's always the danger of protection if the world slows down, right? So that's the good and the bad of the new developments in the manufacturing, field. And in this new game of going away from primary product specialization, of course, the pioneers were these East Asian gang of four dragons or four tigers. But then the really big ones, China and India, came into this game. Right? India, of course, got into services, which is different, but it's in a sense the same thing. So China and India are now sort of climbing the ladder of comparative advantage. And when big giants climb the ladder of comparative advantage, the whole ladder shakes. Right? It's not the same thing as Hong Kong and Singapore climbing the ladder of comparative advantage. So these are the challenges that the world economy is facing, which are of course being exacerbated by this financial crisis. And then remember I said that the Industrial Revolution was a sort of a Faustian bargain, right? Well, slavery we've got over, somehow or the other we've got over it, right? Although the consequences perhaps can still be felt in African institutions and why Africa has not been so successful and so on. But that is a difficult area to get into. But remember I said that the Industrial Revolution also was an energy revolution and also an agricultural revolution, right? So how was the energy problem solved? By going underground, right? Fossil fuels. But then that has come back to haunt the world, right? Because if the Industrial Revolution is only in England, or it's only in Western Europe, then perhaps the world can stand the pollution and carbon emissions that are created from that. But when everybody is catching up with the West, and if everybody is having the Western living standards, and everybody is emitting at the same level, then the Earth as the planet as a whole has got a very big problem, right? So nature is sort of, coming back. It's presenting the bill, right? Dr. Faustus, he has all the things that he wants, but then the devil comes when the midnight hour strikes, right? So on the energy front, that might be happening, right? On the agricultural front, Britain could just outsource its agriculture to New Zealand and, Argentina and places like that. So there's always a frontier, right? But we're running out of the frontier, right? There's no more frontier areas left, right? Maybe outer space or terrific, wonderful new technology or things like that. Maybe we could do those things. But short of that, we seem to have a big problem, right? So in a way, all of these advantages, undoubted advantages that the Industrial Revolution generated, there was also a cost. There was a hidden cost at that time, and the cost is now getting very, very evident, right? So when we talk about the food crisis of today, or the climate crisis of today, or the energy crisis, environmental crisis, these are all consequences of the Industrial Revolution, right? I'm not saying it was a bad thing. I mean, it gave us what? It gave us the promise of growth, and it gave us the cheap actual growth for the last 200-300 years. But but whether we can continue, that is becoming questionable. That's becoming the big challenge. The last thing I'll say, and I'll end before Finn really lowers the boom on me, I'll just spend 2 minutes on sort of geopolitics, which I've talked a bit about in the case of empires, all right? But the last empire we had is the Pax Americana, right? There's 3 empires, the Mongols, the British, and the Americans, right? American empire is getting strained, as we all know, right? And I keep thinking of this British geopolitical theorist, Sir Alfred Mackinder. He wrote, in 1904, he wrote this famous paper called The Geographical Pivot of History, in which he said, he who controls the heartland will control the rimland. So what he meant by this very cryptic utterance is that, Central Asia is really the powerhouse of the world, right? That's where the Mongols conquered the world from, right? That's where we have all the energy supplies of today. And who's going to control that heartland? He was thinking about Germany and Russia, right? But today it's more Russia and China, right? That is competing for control over Central Asia. Then he thought the fight would be over railways, strategic railways, but it's pipelines today that is a really, really important thing. And once again, it is fossil fuels, right? The Industrial Revolution brought about this dependence on fossil fuels, and all the wonderful fossil fuels have been extracted, and petroleum countries and all of that. But now the energy thing is starting to bite, right? And who's getting the power, right? The power is shifting to whoever can control the heartland, right? That's going towards Russia or China. But China still gets 60% of its oil through the Persian Gulf. It has to go through the Straits of Malacca, and the U.S. Navy controls the Straits of Malacca, right? And if India wants to compete with China, there's going to be an Indian Navy in the Indian Ocean, right? And the Chinese, as I said, there was this Muslim admiral, Zhang He, in the 15th century, who sailed in the Indian Ocean. And since then, the Chinese never showed up in the Indian Ocean. But now they're back. Okay, so and in the future, I think the Chinese Navy is going to be very evident in the Indian Ocean. And the Indians also never had much of a navy in any time of their history, but now increasingly, they think they're making investments in the Navy. So if we look at climate change, if we look at environment, if we look at the energy situation, if we look at the food situation, if we look at the geopolitical situation, we run into a lot of challenges, right? But the last 1,000 years have been very successful, and who knows what the next 100 years is going to be. But we've had 25 years of Wider, and another 25 years of Wider. We can study these questions, and I'm sure we'll all have better answers 25 years from now. So thank you for having such patience.